Hey guys! Tonight's story is about a woman who spends her life waiting at a quiet train station, watching trains arrive and leave, without ever stepping onto one. Nothing dramatic happens, and that's the point. The days blur, the platform grows familiar, and waiting itself becomes her home. If you enjoy slow, uneventful stories where time stretches and thoughts drift, this one is made to gently pull you into sleep. So settle in, let the rhythm of the rails carry you, and if this kind of calm helps you rest, please like the video, subscribe to Sleeping Stone Whispers, and come back every night for another quiet journey. Crescent Moon. The bench was made of old wood, polished smooth by years of weather and waiting. It sat on the east platform, slightly away from the crowd, angled just enough to face the tracks where the morning trains arrived. The woman liked this bench because it did not wobble, and because the sunlight reached it first. Every morning, before the station fully woke up, the light would stretch across the platform and rest there quietly, as if it had chosen the spot on purpose. She arrived at the station at the same time each day. Not early enough to feel rushed, not late enough to feel guilty. The clock above the ticket office showed a few minutes past 7 when she walked through the entrance, her steps unhurried, her bag light and easy on her shoulder. Inside the bag were things she did not often use: an old notebook, a pen that still worked, a folded scarf, and a ticket she never checked. She did not think about the ticket. It stayed where it was. The station smelled faintly of iron, dust, and tea. Somewhere near the exit, a small stall had begun boiling water, and the steam drifted slowly, mixing with the cool morning air. The woman breathed it in without noticing she was doing so. She had been breathing it in for years. She sat on the bench and placed her bag beside her, always on the same side. From here, she could see the rails stretching into the distance, narrowing until they disappeared into a pale blur. The rails were quiet for now. No vibrations yet. No sound of approach. Just the soft hum of the station waking up in pieces. Other people arrived, but she did not watch them closely. People moved in patterns, quick steps, glances at watches, bags held tight. They gathered near the edge of the platform, standing behind the yellow line. The woman stayed seated. The bench held her weight patiently, as it always did. Above her, the announcement speaker crackled and cleared its throat. A voice listed train numbers and destinations, each one spoken carefully, as if precision mattered more than meaning. The woman listened without listening. The names of cities passed through her mind like clouds, leaving no shape behind. When the first train arrived, the platform stirred. There was a distant rumble, then a growing sound, steady and low. The rails began to sing softly, a familiar vibration that reached the bench through the ground. The woman felt it in her feet and rested her hands on her lap. The train slowed, metal against metal, air pushed aside. Doors opened. People stepped off, people stepped on. There were greetings, hurried movements, the soft thud of bags placed on the floor inside the carriage. The woman remained where she was. She did not think about getting up. The idea did not arrive fully formed. It hovered somewhere far away, unfinished, like a sentence that had been started years ago and never completed. The doors closed. A whistle sounded. The train pulled away, leaving behind a brief rush of wind and a thinning echo. The platform relaxed again. The station returned to its steady breathing. The woman watched the empty track where the train had been. She noticed small things instead, the way the light shifted slightly, the way dust settled back onto the rails, the way the sound faded more slowly than she expected. Time moved differently here. It stretched and softened, losing its sharp edges. She adjusted her position on the bench, crossing her ankles. Around her, the day continued, but she felt no urgency to follow it. She had nowhere to be beyond this place, and no reason to leave before she was ready. The bench, the platform, the east-facing tracks, they asked nothing of her. And so she waited, not for a specific train, not for a destination, but for the feeling that sometimes came and sometimes did not. Until then, the bench faced the tracks faced the distance, and the woman stayed exactly where she was. Mornings at the station always began the same way, quietly and without announcement. The air was cooler then, heavier with the smell of iron from the rails and the faint bitterness of tea drifting from the small stall near the entrance. The woman noticed these things without thinking about them. They were simply there, like the ground beneath her feet or the sky above the platform. She arrived just as the station was finishing its first stretch of waking. The shutters of the shops were halfway up, their metal edges catching the light. Someone swept the floor near the ticket counter, pushing dust from one place to another without much urgency. The woman walked past slowly, her footsteps blending into the soft echo of the hall. The tea stall was always the first to feel alive. Water boiled in a large kettle, sending thin streams of steam into the air. Cups were stacked neatly, their rims chipped and worn. The man who ran the stall moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had repeated the same motions for years. He poured, stirred, wiped the counter, and waited. Sometimes the woman bought a cup. Sometimes she did not. Either way, the smell followed her to the platform. She liked how the scent mixed with the iron from the tracks. Together, they created a feeling that belonged only to mornings. Afternoons smelled different, and evenings carried their own weight. But mornings were light and unfinished, as if the day had not yet decided what it wanted to become. The bench was cool when she sat down. The wood held the night's chill for a while before warming under the sun. She placed her hands flat beside her and waited for the warmth to arrive. This waiting was easy. It did not require thought or effort. It passed naturally, like breathing. Around her, people held cups of tea between their hands, using the heat to wake themselves fully. There were quiet sips, soft clinks of cups being set down, murmured conversations that faded before they reached her. The woman listened to none of it directly. Sounds came and went without settling. The first announcement of the day echoed across the platform. It was always a little distorted, stretched thin by the speaker. The woman had learned to recognize the pauses more than the words. She knew when a sentence would end before it did. She knew the rhythm of it better than its meaning. A train arrived, earlier than the others. It brought workers and travelers who moved with purpose. They stepped quickly, eyes forward, already thinking about where they were going next. The woman watched them briefly, then returned her attention to the tracks themselves. The rails shone faintly in the morning light, clean and straight, leading away without hesitation. She wrapped her scarf loosely around her neck, even when the air was not cold enough to require it. The scarf smelled faintly of home, though she could not have said where home was anymore. It had been washed many times, the fabric softened, the color faded into something gentle and unremarkable. Time moved slowly in the mornings. It did not rush. Minutes felt wide and open, easy to step into and stay within. The woman liked this best. Later in the day, time grew heavier, pressing forward. But now, it drifted. She took out her notebook once, opened it, and looked at the blank page. The pen rested in the fold. She did not write. After a moment, she closed the notebook and placed it back in her bag. The action felt complete, even without words. The smell of tea lingered as the sun climbed higher. One by one, the early trains came and went. Each arrival stirred the air, each departure returned it to stillness. The woman remained on her bench, watching the light move across the platform. Mornings did not ask her questions. They did not demand decisions. They allowed her to sit, to breathe, and to exist quietly among iron, tea, and passing trains. And for now, that was enough. There had been a time when the idea of boarding a train still felt possible. Not urgent, not necessary, but present, like a door left slightly open. The woman did not remember the exact day that feeling faded, only that it had once existed, quietly, without pressure. The first train she did not board arrived on a morning much like any other. The air carried the usual scent of iron and tea. The platform looked the same. The bench waited in its place. Nothing marked the moment as important, and that was why it stayed with her. She had been standing then, not sitting. Her bag was on her shoulder, a little heavier than it would be later in life. Inside were more things: clothes folded carefully, a book she had intended to read, a small object wrapped in cloth that she had not opened in years. She stood behind the yellow line and watched the rails tremble as the train approached. The sound grew louder, filling the space around her. People gathered close, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Someone checked the destination board again, just to be sure. The woman did not check. She already knew where the train was going, or at least she thought she did. When the train stopped, the doors opened with a familiar hiss. Warm air spilled out, carrying the mixed smells of metal, fabric, and distant places. She took a step forward, then stopped. The step was small, almost unnoticeable. No one else saw it. It belonged only to her. She waited for something, a feeling, a certainty, a signal she could trust. It did not arrive. The platform remained solid beneath her feet. The train remained open and ready. Time paused gently, as if giving her room. People passed around her, brushing by without apology. Bags bumped against her leg. A voice called out a goodbye. The woman stayed where she was, holding her bag strapped tightly, as if it might pull her forward on its own. The doors began to close. Slowly at first, then with decision. She watched them meet, sealing the space she had not entered. The sound was final but not loud. It did not echo. The train pulled away. The wind followed it briefly, lifting her scarf and cooling her face. She stood still until the sound faded and the platform returned to itself. Only then did she realize her hands were trembling slightly. She loosened her grip and let her arms fall to her sides. Nothing else happened. No regret rushed in. No relief followed. There was only a quiet awareness that something had been left behind, though she could not say what it was. The station continued. Another announcement played. Another train was listed. Later, she sat on the bench for the first time. The wood was unfamiliar then, rougher than it would become. She placed her bag beside her and watched the tracks, feeling oddly settled, as if she had arrived somewhere rather than stayed behind. In the days that followed, she returned to the station. Sometimes she stood. Sometimes she sat. Trains came and went. Each time, the possibility of boarding felt slightly thinner, like a thread being gently pulled. She did not tell herself she would never leave. She did not make promises or decisions. She simply allowed the moment to pass, again and again, until passing became a habit. The first train she did not board did not look different from the others. It did not carry signs or warnings. It left no mark on the platform. But it changed the shape of her days, quietly and without insistence. And so, she waited. Not because she was certain, but because waiting felt easier than stepping forward. The timetable hung on the wall near the stairs, printed in small, orderly rows. It was updated often, though the woman could not remember noticing when it changed. The paper was always clean, the lines straight, the numbers precise. It promised structure, direction, and certainty, things she did not ask for. She began reading it out of habit rather than need. Each morning, after sitting on the bench and placing her bag at her side, she would stand and walk slowly toward it. Her steps were measured, unhurried, as if she were moving through water. She stopped at the same distance each time, close enough to see clearly, far enough to avoid feeling involved. Her eyes moved down the columns. Train numbers. Arrival times. Destinations written in familiar names that no longer stirred images. She read them all the same way, letting them pass without attaching meaning. She did not check the current time against the schedule. She did not plan. The act of reading was complete on its own. Sometimes her finger traced a line unconsciously, following a route from top to bottom. The movement was slow and gentle. When she reached the end, she lifted her hand and began again somewhere else. The paper never responded. It stayed flat and quiet, offering nothing beyond what it already showed. Around her, people used the timetable differently. They leaned in close, searching for specific numbers. They frowned, nodded, stepped back, and adjusted their plans. The woman watched them briefly, then returned her attention to the page. She wondered, without concern, how it felt to need the information so badly. Once, she memorized a schedule without meaning to. The times settled into her mind simply because she had read them so often. Even then, she did nothing with them. Knowledge, she had learned, did not always lead to movement. The station clock ticked steadily above her. She did not look at it. Time no longer needed confirmation. It moved forward whether she followed it or not. The timetable did not hurry her, and she did not hurry herself. After a while, she stepped back and returned to the bench. The walk felt familiar, comforting in its repetition. The bench accepted her weight. The platform stretched out in front of her, unchanged. Trains arrived according to the schedule she had just read. She recognized them as they came, not by their destinations but by their sounds. The pitch of their approach, the length of their pause, the way they left. The timetable became unnecessary, yet she continued to read it each day. There was something soothing about its order. The straight lines, the even spacing, the certainty that trains would come whether she boarded them or not. It was a reminder that movement existed, even if she remained still. She took the timetable seriously, but not personally. It was not speaking to her. It was simply there, doing what it was meant to do. She respected that. As the morning passed into afternoon, the light shifted, and the paper reflected it differently. Shadows crossed the wall. New people arrived. The woman stayed. When she finally looked away for the last time that day, she felt no loss. The information would still be there tomorrow, waiting to be read without intention, just as she would be waiting on her bench, content to let the trains follow their paths without her. The names of the trains were written in small letters on metal boards and printed again on tickets, timetables, and signs. At first, they meant nothing to the woman. They were just words, chosen long before she arrived at the station. But over time, the names stayed with her, settling into her thoughts quietly. She did not set out to learn them. They came to her through repetition. Each morning, the same names were announced in the same calm voice, pronounced carefully, with a pause before and after. She heard them while sitting on the bench, while watching the tracks, while listening without paying attention. Some names sounded heavy, as if they carried long distances inside them. Others felt light, almost brief. A few repeated so often that they became familiar, like neighbors she never spoke to. She recognized them not by their destinations, but by how they arrived. Early or late, fast or slow, loud or restrained. When a train approached, she sometimes knew its name before it was announced. The sound gave it away. The rhythm of its wheels, the length of its whistle, the way the air shifted around it. The recognition brought no satisfaction, only a soft sense of acknowledgement, like recognizing a face in a crowd. People around her spoke the names with urgency. They said them into phones, repeated them to companions, muttered them under their breath. The woman did not repeat them aloud. She held them quietly, allowing them to exist without use. Once, a child asked her which train was arriving. She looked down at the tracks, listened, and answered correctly. The child thanked her and ran off. The moment passed without leaving a mark. She did not feel useful or proud. It was simply something she knew. The names began to connect to times of day rather than places. One belonged to the early morning light. Another arrived when the sun sat high and still. One always came as shadows grew long across the platform. She measured her day by their presence. She never imagined herself inside any of them. The names did not invite her. They did not suggest stories or futures. They existed separately from her life, moving forward while she stayed behind. In her bag, the ticket remained folded, its details unread. She knew it must also carry a name, a number, a destination. She did not look. Knowing the names of the trains was enough. Knowing her own plans felt unnecessary. As days passed, the station began to feel smaller, more contained. The trains passed through it like guests, arriving and leaving without settling. The woman stayed, steady and quiet, learning their names not as promises, but as rhythms. By evening, when the announcements slowed and the platform emptied, she could still hear the names echoing softly in her mind. They did not disturb her rest. They faded as gently as they arrived. She walked home with the sounds of them lingering, knowing she would hear them again the next day. The woman who learned the names of trains did not follow them. She simply remembered them, and that was enough. At first, the sound of a departing train had felt large. It filled the station, pushed air aside, and demanded attention. The woman remembered noticing it once, long ago, as something final and important. But sounds, like all things repeated often enough, slowly changed their shape. Now, she recognized departures the way one recognizes breathing in a quiet room. They were present without needing focus. The sequence was always the same: the brief announcement, the closing doors, the soft warning tone, and then the gradual pull as metal began to move against metal. Each part followed the other patiently. She sat on her bench and listened without lifting her head. The sound traveled through the ground first, a gentle vibration that reached her feet before her ears. Then came the deeper noise, steady and calm, neither rushed nor delayed. It no longer startled her. It confirmed where she was. Some departures were slow and careful, as if the train itself was reluctant to leave. Others were quicker, confident in their direction. The woman learned to tell the difference without looking. She could close her eyes and know when the last carriage passed, when the sound thinned, when silence returned. Around her, people reacted to departures with small gestures, waves, hurried steps, sighs of relief or frustration. The woman did none of these things. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. Her shoulders remained still. The sound passed through her without asking for response. There was a moment, always the same, just after a train left. The air shifted slightly. Dust lifted and settled again. The platform seemed to exhale. This moment had become her favorite. It felt clean and open, like the space after a sentence ends. She noticed how quickly the station forgot each departure. Within seconds, conversations resumed. Footsteps returned to their usual rhythm. Another announcement prepared itself. Nothing lingered. The woman admired this about the place. It did not hold on. Once, a particularly long train departed late in the afternoon. Its sound stretched on, echoing farther than usual. The woman followed it with her eyes until it disappeared completely. Even then, she felt no pull to follow. The sound faded, and with it, any suggestion of movement. The bench creaked softly as she shifted her weight. The sound blended easily with the rest. She wondered briefly when she had stopped associating departures with loss. There was no clear answer. The feeling had simply worn away, smoothed down by time. Departures no longer marked endings for her. They marked continuity. One left so that another could arrive. One sound ended so another could begin. The station remained, and so did she. As evening approached, the departures grew less frequent. Each one felt more noticeable, not because it mattered more, but because there were fewer sounds to share the space. The woman listened more carefully then, not out of need, but out of habit. When the final train of the evening left, the sound lingered a little longer in the cool air. The woman stayed seated, letting the quiet return fully. She did not rush away. There was no reason to interrupt the calm. The sound of departure had become familiar enough to fade into comfort. It no longer suggested distance or change. It simply reminded her that movement existed, even if she chose stillness. And as the station settled into silence, she remained on her bench, breathing evenly, surrounded by echoes that no longer asked her to follow. Waiting began without ceremony. It did not arrive as a decision or an announcement. It grew slowly, woven into the woman's days until it became as ordinary as walking or sitting. Over time, it shaped her hours more clearly than any schedule ever had. She woke each morning knowing where she would go. The knowledge carried no excitement and no reluctance. It simply existed. After small, quiet preparations, she left her home and walked the familiar route to the station, her steps matching the pace she had settled into long ago. At the platform, waiting took on form. It was the way she placed her bag beside her on the bench. It was the way her eyes rested on the tracks without searching for anything in particular. It was the way she listened to announcements without reacting. These actions repeated themselves daily, creating a rhythm that felt steady and reliable. Waiting filled the hours without effort. She did not count the minutes. She did not wonder how long she had been there. Time passed around her, but waiting held her in place, gently and without strain. It required nothing from her except presence. Waiting began without ceremony. It did not arrive as a decision or an announcement. It grew slowly, woven into the woman's days until it became as ordinary as walking or sitting. Over time, it shaped her hours more clearly than any schedule ever had. She woke each morning knowing where she would go. The knowledge carried no excitement and no reluctance. It simply existed. After small, quiet preparations, she left her home and walked the familiar route to the station, her steps matching the pace she had settled into long ago. At the platform, waiting took on form. It was the way she placed her bag beside her on the bench. It was the way her eyes rested on the tracks without searching for anything in particular. It was the way she listened to announcements without reacting. These actions repeated themselves daily, creating a rhythm that felt steady and reliable. Waiting filled the hours without effort. She did not count the minutes. She did not wonder how long she had been there. Time passed around her, but waiting held her in place, gently and without strain. It required nothing from her except presence. The station clock hung high above the main platform, round and pale, with black hands that moved at a steady, unquestioned pace. It had been there longer than most of the benches, longer than many of the signs. People trusted it without thinking, glancing up as they walked, adjusting their steps according to its quiet authority. The woman noticed the clock every day, but she no longer looked at it for guidance. Its presence had become decorative rather than functional, like a picture that never changed. She could see it from her bench if she lifted her head slightly, though most days she did not bother. There was a time when the clock had mattered to her. She remembered standing beneath it once, checking the minutes again and again, measuring her breath against its movement. Back then, time had felt sharp and exact, something to be managed carefully. That feeling had softened and then disappeared. Now, the clock's hands moved without consequence. They pointed to moments she did not claim. Morning passed into afternoon, afternoon into evening, all without her assistance. The clock continued its work faithfully, even after she had stopped needing it. She learned the time in other ways. The angle of the sunlight on the platform told her when noon had passed. The length of shadows stretching toward the track spoke of late afternoon. The cooling air signaled evening more clearly than any number ever could. People around her still obeyed the clock. They hurried when it told them to hurry. They sighed when it told them they were late. The woman watched these reactions with a distant calm. She wondered how it felt to let a clock decide the shape of a day. Once, The clock stopped for several minutes. No announcement explained it. The hands froze in place, caught between two numbers. A few people noticed and grew uneasy. They checked their phones, compared times, waited for correction. The woman felt nothing at all. The stillness of the clock matched her own. When the clock resumed its movement, no one applauded. It simply continued, as if it had never paused. The woman returned her gaze to the tracks, unconcerned by the interruption. She realized then that the clock no longer marked beginnings or endings for her. It did not tell her when to arrive or when to leave. It did not remind her of missed connections or approaching deadlines. Time existed, but it did not press against her. The station itself seemed aware of this shift. Sounds came and went without reference to the hour. Trains arrived whether the clock was watched or not. Announcements were made on schedule, but she heard them as tones rather than instructions. Sometimes she imagined the clock watching her in return, measuring her stillness against its movement. The thought did not trouble her. If anything, it felt balanced. One moved endlessly. One remained. As evening settled in and the station lights flickered on, the clock face glowed softly. Its hands continued their slow journey. The woman stayed seated, breathing evenly, her bag untouched at her side. When she eventually stood to leave, she did not check the time. She never did anymore. The clock lost meaning not because it failed, but because she no longer asked anything of it. And so it kept ticking above the platform, faithful and precise, while below it, the woman lived her hours without counting them, content to let time pass without being measured. The yellow line ran the length of the platform, bright and unbroken, painted there to remind people where to stop. Most passengers noticed it only when they stepped too close, adjusting their feet without thinking. For the woman, the line had always been visible. Her shoes remained behind it. They were practical shoes, worn at the heels, comfortable enough for long hours of standing or sitting. She polished them occasionally, not out of pride, but out of habit. Each morning, they carried her to the same place and stopped at the same boundary. She remembered when she had crossed the line once, years ago. The memory was faint and unimportant, softened by time. Now, the line marked a limit she did not question. It did not feel like a rule. It felt like a natural edge. When trains arrived, people gathered close, toes nearly touching the paint. Some leaned forward, eager, ready. The woman watched from her bench, her feet planted firmly behind the line. She did not lean. She did not prepare. The yellow line faded slightly in places, worn by countless shoes passing over it. In some spots, the paint was thin, barely visible. Even there, she did not step forward. The line existed for her even when it could not be seen. She noticed how people behaved once they crossed it. Their posture changed. Their focus sharpened. They entered a different state, one filled with intention and movement. The woman remained outside of that state, observing it calmly. Once, a sudden announcement startled the crowd, and people shifted backward quickly. A few feet crossed the line in reverse, retreating. The woman did not move. She had never been close enough to need retreat. Her shoes rested side by side, aligned neatly. They had learned the shape of the platform over time, the small cracks and uneven tiles. They fit the space as comfortably as her body fit the bench. The line also separated sound. On one side, there was the rush of wind, the closeness of the train. On the other, there was a steadier calm. The woman stayed where the air felt even and predictable. She wondered briefly whether her shoes remembered other places. The thought passed without answer. They belonged here now, shaped by daily returns and long hours of stillness. As evening approached, the yellow line dimmed under artificial light. It lost some of its brightness but kept its meaning for those who needed it. For the woman, it remained simply where her shoes stopped. When the final trains arrived and left, she stayed seated, feet unmoving. The platform emptied gradually, leaving the line quiet and unused. Eventually, she stood and walked away from it, her shoes following the familiar path back through the station. They had never crossed the yellow line, not out of fear or rule, but because there had never been a reason to. And so the line remained behind her each night, waiting, bright and patient, just as she would return to it the next morning, ready to stop exactly where she always did. The ticket rested in her bag, folded along familiar creases that had softened over the years. It was small, almost fragile, printed with letters and numbers that once promised destinations. Now, it held no purpose except as an object to hold, a companion for long, quiet hours. She rarely looked at it. When she did, it was not to check a date or a train number. She simply unfolded it, smoothed it against her fingers, and felt the weight of intention that had once been there. The ticket was not a key, not a promise, not a call to action. It was a presence, a soft reminder that she could go, if she ever wished. Others treated tickets differently. They clutched them tightly, folded them into wallets, handed them to conductors with urgency. For the woman, the ticket required nothing. It did not demand a decision, a step forward, or even acknowledgement. She carried it because she liked its quiet steadiness, its delicate permanence. Sitting on the bench, she sometimes held the ticket loosely in one hand, letting her fingers brush the printed surface. Each fold, each crease, each corner carried memories she did not fully recall. There was a faint rustle when she shifted it, a tiny sound that went unnoticed by anyone else, but which marked the passage of her hours. The ticket reminded her of possibility without imposing it. It existed like the bench beneath her or the tracks beyond. She could choose to use it, though she never did. It was an object of patience, and she had learned the quiet art of waiting with it. When trains arrived, she did not glance at her ticket. Its numbers and letters meant nothing in comparison to the rhythm of the rails, the sound of wheels on metal, the hush of air after departure. Yet, the ticket remained with her, folded neatly, a companion she did not need to question. Evenings, when the platform emptied and the station lights glowed softly, she would take the ticket out, hold it briefly, and then return it to its place. This simple act marked the day, a ritual without urgency. It was not for anyone else, not for memory or habit, it was for the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had it, and that it would always be there. By night, the ticket returned to the depths of her bag, waiting for tomorrow, ready to exist once more. She had mastered the art of holding it without action, understanding that its presence alone could anchor her in a world of constant departures. And so, she carried it endlessly, not as a tool, but as a companion, learning that the act of possession could itself be a form of quiet patience, a meditation on stillness, and a gentle resistance to the rush of movement all around her. Afternoons at the station had a slower rhythm. The sunlight shifted across the platform, softening into long, golden streaks that made the edges of objects glow faintly. The woman sat on her bench, her bag resting beside her, and watched as other lives moved in and out of her view, leaving without urgency or fanfare. Passengers arrived with purpose. Briefcases swung, coats were adjusted, shoes tapped the concrete. Some carried children by the hand, others carried suitcases in silent determination. They glanced at the platform, at the announcements, at their watches, and then they stepped toward the trains, crossing the yellow line with certainty. She observed quietly, her feet planted firmly behind the line, her gaze steady. The trains themselves seemed indifferent to the lives that carried themselves aboard. Doors opened and closed, carrying people away to cities, towns, and homes she would never visit. Some faces appeared briefly at the windows, expressions caught between anticipation and resignation, and then they were gone. She did not watch them long enough to feel sadness or curiosity. She simply noted the movement, the rhythm of departure. Afternoons at the station had a slower rhythm. The sunlight shifted across the platform, softening into long, golden streaks that made the edges of objects glow faintly. The woman sat on her bench, her bag resting beside her, and watched as other lives moved in and out of her view, leaving without urgency or fanfare. Passengers arrived with purpose. Briefcases swung, coats were adjusted, shoes tapped the concrete. Some carried children by the hand. Others carried suitcases in silent determination. They glanced at the platform, at the announcements, at their watches, and then they stepped toward the trains, crossing the yellow line with certainty. She observed quietly, her feet planted firmly behind the line, her gaze steady. The trains themselves seemed indifferent to the lives that carried themselves aboard. Doors opened and closed, carrying people away to cities, towns, and homes she would never visit. Some faces appeared briefly at the windows, expressions caught between anticipation and resignation, and then they were gone. She did not watch them long enough to feel sadness or curiosity. She simply noted the movement, the rhythm of departure. She noticed patterns in the comings and goings. Certain passengers arrived at nearly the same time each day, carrying similar luggage, wearing familiar expressions. Some waved, hurried, or paused to check a phone. Others walked slowly, as if testing the platform before committing. She did not engage with them, but she understood their habits as part of the platform's quiet order. Rain arrived quietly at the station one afternoon, first as a few hesitant drops that tapped the platform roof, then as a soft, steady patter that blurred the edges of the world. The woman was already on her bench, bag at her side, and she listened without moving, letting the sound seep into her mind as though it belonged there. The tracks glistened under the water, shining darkly with reflections of the station lights and the pale afternoon sky. Each drop made the rails hum lightly, a faint rhythm that matched the slow beating of her own thoughts. She watched puddles form in small depressions along the concrete, their surfaces rippling as tiny stones and leaves floated briefly before settling. Passengers hurried through the rain, coats pulled tight, umbrellas flicking open, shoes slapping wet ground. They spoke in hurried tones, voices bouncing off the station walls. The woman did not notice them directly. She observed from a distance, seeing only movement, hearing only fragments, letting the rain dominate the air. Trains approached through the haze, their metal bodies wet and glimmering. The sound of wheels against soaked rails was softer than usual, muffled by water and the rhythm of falling drops. When they departed, the wind carried the smell of wet metal and earth toward the bench. She inhaled it slowly, letting it mix with the faint aroma of tea from the stall nearby. The rain seemed to slow time. Minutes stretched longer, measured not by announcements or clock hands, but by the soft, continuous fall on the platform roof. She tilted her head slightly, listening as each drop struck wood, metal, and stone. In this sound, there was no urgency, no meaning beyond itself. Thoughts drifted alongside the rain. She considered nothing specific. Nothing to act upon, nothing to resolve. They were small, quiet thoughts that arrived and left, like leaves carried by the wind. Sometimes they followed the trains as they disappeared into the distance. Sometimes they lingered, soft and undisturbed. The ticket in her bag remained folded, untouched, while the rain whispered across her fingertips when she brushed the bag's edge. She thought of nothing she needed to do with it. The trains came and went regardless, the passengers moved past her, and the rain continued, unbroken and patient. She liked how the rain made the platform feel separate, enclosed. Even the usual hum of arrivals and departures became muted, transformed into a background melody that blended with her own steady presence. There was a harmony in watching the world move through water while remaining completely still. By evening, the rain softened, turning into light drops that slid along the tracks. The platform grew cooler, the reflections of the light stretching longer and thinner across the wet concrete. The trains slowed their pace, fewer people remained, and the station settled into a gentle quiet. The woman remained on her bench, feeling the rain settle not only on the tracks but also in her mind. It washed nothing away and demanded nothing. It only existed, as did she, together in the steady, endless rhythm of waiting. The station was full of voices, yet most of them never reached her directly. Passengers spoke in hurried tones, exchanged brief greetings, or muttered into phones. Some conversations were loud and punctuated with laughter, others were soft, hesitant, or lost in their own pauses. The woman noticed them all without listening fully. They passed by like shadows, present but untouchable. She had once imagined speaking to someone here, perhaps asking about a train, or commenting on the weather, or simply exchanging a polite smile. But the words never left her mind. They lingered at the edge of thought, unfinished and quiet, never demanding form or sound. She had learned to let them stay that way. Around her, small groups formed naturally, families with children, colleagues hurrying to catch the next train, strangers meeting briefly before parting. They spoke, gestured, nodded, laughed, and then dispersed. The woman remained on her bench, her presence unobtrusive, like a still pond beside a flowing river. Sometimes she imagined conversations that might have happened. She imagined responses, voices matching hers, gentle exchanges that ended without conflict. Yet she never acted on these imaginings. There was a strange comfort in knowing that the conversation could exist only in her mind, perfect and uninterrupted by reality. Announcements and train sounds cut through the murmurs occasionally, but she did not notice them in the same way as others. They were part of the station's rhythm, like wind brushing across the tracks. People responded, shifted, and moved accordingly, she simply observed. The ticket in her bag seemed to participate in these silent dialogues. She sometimes touched it when thoughts of speaking arose, as if the object could anchor her to stillness. No question was asked, no answer expected. It was enough to hold, to consider, and then to return to quiet. The platform itself encouraged silence. Even among people, there was an unspoken understanding that each was moving towards something different. Some spoke loudly, some whispered, and some remained like her, present without engagement. The station allowed all of this to exist without judgment. When a train arrived, conversations paused briefly, hushed by the noise of doors opening and the soft clatter of wheels on wet tracks. Then they resumed, fading in and out. The woman's thoughts remained her own, undisturbed by these passing words. Evenings were especially quiet for conversations. The remaining passengers spoke less, often merely nodding to one another or muttering to themselves. The woman watched, noting the small gestures, imagining gentle replies that would never occur. By night, the platform emptied, leaving the station full of echoes of words that had been spoken and words that had never been spoken. The woman stayed on her bench, her own silence complete. She understood the quiet art of letting conversations exist without form, allowing them to live in thought rather than speech. Late autumn arrived slowly at the station, bringing cooler air and a soft, drifting melancholy. Leaves had begun to scatter across the platform, carried by occasional gusts that passed through the open spaces. They gathered in corners, rustling softly underfoot when people walked by, yet never disturbing the woman on her bench. The sun hung lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the tracks and the platform tiles. The light was pale, almost hesitant, spilling weakly through the station's glass roof. It struck the benches, the yellow line, and the rails with a soft glow, giving everything a faint golden outline before fading quickly into shade. She wrapped her scarf more tightly around her neck, though the chill was not sharp enough to sting. Her bag rested at her side, unchanged in its contents: notebook, pen, folded scarf, and the small ticket she held for years without using. Each item seemed heavier in the cool air, as if the season added weight to the objects around her. Few passengers came during these afternoons. Some carried umbrellas folded against the wind. Others moved briskly, cheeks flushed, shoes clacking against the tiles. They glanced at the tracks, then at the timetable, and continued, unaware of the woman watching silently from her bench. The platform seemed to shrink in scale when fewer people were present, yet it felt more expansive in its quiet. The trains themselves looked different in autumn. Metal gleamed faintly under the pale sun, their colors muted by the season's light. Sounds were softer, carried differently in the colder air. The woman listened closely, not to catch a specific train, but to notice the slight variations, the gentle sighs of wind against the tracks, the distant hum of movement. Leaves swirled briefly as the wind swept along the platform. One landed near her shoes, spinning slightly before coming to rest. She did not move it. Its presence did not demand action. The small detail remained, quietly absorbed into the larger scene, trains arriving and departing, footsteps moving across tiles, shadows stretching with the day. Autumn brought a kind of stillness that was new yet familiar. Even as the world shifted around her, she remained constant. She did not need to board a train, to speak to another passenger, or to alter her position on the bench. The season passed around her, a gentle reminder of change, while she remained rooted in waiting. Announcements came and went, their voices softened by the cooler air. People responded with subtle movements, adjusting coats or glancing at watches. She did not react. She simply observed, letting each sound and motion become part of the quiet tapestry surrounding her. As evening approached, the sky grew deeper, tinged with shades of gray and muted orange. The platform's lights flickered on, casting pools of warmth against the cold. The train slowed, the remaining passengers dwindled, and the station exhaled softly, settling into the calm of late autumn. The woman stayed on her bench, feeling the cool air and the faint rustle of leaves at her feet. She thought little of the passing season, yet felt its presence in everything, the way light shifted, how sound traveled, and the soft hush that seemed to blanket the platform. Autumn, like the trains, came and went in its own rhythm. The woman remained in hers, steady and patient, observing quietly, letting the platform and the season move around her without ever stepping forward, letting change happen while she simply waited. The woman had begun to notice something curious. She remembered the trains more clearly than the people who boarded them. Faces blurred after a few moments, voices faded, and names dissolved into quiet air. But trains, their sounds, their rhythms, their departures and arrivals, remained vivid in her mind, as if etched into memory with deliberate care. Each train carried a unique signature. Some arrived softly, gliding over the rails with gentle precision, while others rumbled with determined authority, shaking the platform slightly as they passed. The woman could close her eyes and hear the difference, identify which one approached long before it was announced. People, by contrast, seemed fleeting, passing through her perception without leaving lasting impression. She thought about why this might be. Trains followed a pattern, arrived at predictable times, repeated their behaviors day after day. People, however, were unpredictable. They rushed, paused, laughed, whispered, and vanished. Their actions were sudden, fleeting, and often incomplete. The consistency of trains created a gentle familiarity that the randomness of humans could not. Sometimes she watched a train depart and felt a quiet connection to it. The wheels hummed along the rails, the doors closed with their familiar hiss, and the sound of air shifted and faded. She remembered the sequence perfectly: the arrival, the boarding, the final pull out of the station. People moved with it, but their presence did not linger. Their lives were transient, the train itself was enduring. She had a mental catalogue of trains she had watched countless times. Each one had a number, a name, a personality in the rhythm it carried across the tracks. They became markers of her own days, moments to measure time without needing a clock or a timetable. Each departure and arrival held significance that she understood silently. Passengers' faces came and went in her memory, often blending together. She could recall the blur of coats and the sound of hurried shoes, but details evaporated quickly. Yet a single train, the long stretch of carriages, the whistle's tone, the vibration on the platform, remained distinct, reliable, almost comforting in its permanence. Even when she left the station briefly, the memory of the trains lingered. The names, the arrival patterns, the way a particular train slowed into the platform, all of it returned to her mind as easily as breathing. People rarely did. Occasionally, she might recall a fleeting expression, a smile, or a hurried wave, but it was the train that remained alive in her thoughts. She sometimes wondered whether this preference for trains over people was peculiar or natural. Perhaps it was the rhythm, the repetition, the predictability that drew her attention. Perhaps it was the gentle, dependable sound, contrasting with the chaos and impermanence of human life. Either way, she had learned to rely on them as silent companions. Evenings emphasized this clarity. As shadows lengthened and the platform quieted, trains still arrived and departed. Each one left its mark in her memory, distinct and unmistakable. People had mostly gone, their stories were lost to the wind. She sat on her bench, steady, listening, remembering. In the end, she realized she had grown more connected to these moving machines than to anyone who passed by. Their predictability offered a strange comfort, a structure in the gentle disorder of the station. People were fleeting, but the trains endured, remembered in her mind with perfect, calm clarity. And so she stayed, day after day, letting the trains carve themselves into memory while the faces around them blurred into quiet, passing shadows. There was a time when the station felt like a place of decisions. Watches were checked, steps were hurried, and every announcement seemed to press against her, urging action. But over the years, urgency had quietly faded, like water soaking into the platform's cracks, leaving nothing behind. She arrived each morning with the same light steps, unhurried and steady. The rhythm of her day no longer depended on schedules or arrivals. The trains came and went, people moved with purpose, and announcements rang out clearly, but none of it demanded that she act. Her body had learned the rhythm of stillness, her mind the comfort of observing without interference. Even when a train arrived early, or a crowd gathered unexpectedly, she remained calm. The yellow line did not press against her feet. The bench held her in place. The platform might rush around her, but she existed in a separate, slower dimension. Time, once a sharp and pressing force, had softened into something malleable and gentle. She noticed how urgency affected others. People checked phones repeatedly, muttered apologies, adjusted coats, shifted bags, and exchanged hurried words. The woman observed these small, frantic movements with a quiet detachment. She had once shared that tension, but it had drained away, leaving behind only patience. Even announcements lost their power to spur action. Numbers and destinations were read, instructions given, doors opened, but the compulsion to respond had long disappeared. She could sit through the busiest rush and feel no impulse to move beyond her bench. The urgency of the world belonged to others, she had surrendered to a slower rhythm. Her own actions had become deliberate, careful, and unpressured. Standing, sitting, adjusting her bag or scarf, everything was done without haste. Waiting was no longer simply a habit, it was a practiced occupation, a daily exercise in letting time pass without interference. The trains, arriving and departing with mechanical precision, no longer stirred excitement or fear of missing them. They were part of the station's steady heartbeat, and she had grown accustomed to their presence. Urgency, once an invisible hand pushing her forward, had vanished like a distant echo. By late afternoon, the platform's pace slowed naturally. Fewer passengers moved hurriedly. Sounds became softer, shadows longer, air cooler. The woman remained seated, unaffected. Time's disappearance of urgency mirrored her own inner stillness. Even when a particularly long or noisy train arrived, she noticed it calmly, observing its approach, its pause, and its departure, without any sense of pressure. The world rushed past her, but she was anchored by an internal patience that had grown stronger each day. When evening came, the platform emptied gradually. Urgency, which had once accompanied arrivals and departures, no longer existed for her. It had been replaced with a gentle continuity, a steady awareness that life moves forward, and she can remain still without consequence. And so she waited, not because she was compelled, but because she no longer felt the need to hurry. The slow disappearance of urgency had given her a strange freedom, the quiet liberty to exist in her own rhythm, observing without action, calm in a world that continued to move around her. Evenings had a particular quality at the station, a gentle hush that suggested emptiness even when life lingered quietly all around. The sun dipped low, and shadows stretched across the platform tiles, lengthening until they seemed to merge with the soft glow of the station lights. To a casual observer, the place might have seemed deserted. To her, it was full in ways that could not be measured. The crowd thinned slowly. Passengers arrived sporadically, a small group here, a lone traveler there. Their movements were measured, deliberate, less hurried than the morning rush. Footsteps echoed faintly, soft conversations murmured, and bags scraped lightly against the tiles. Each sound was distinct against the vast quiet of the platform. Yet she remained seated, her bench holding her as steadily as it had for years. Even when a train arrived, bringing with it the brief shuffle of passengers, she noticed more the empty spaces than the people themselves. The cars hissed open, doors clicked closed, and the wind carried distant echoes across the tracks. A single whisper, a muted laugh, a child's sigh, these sounds punctuated the evening without disturbing her. The station felt empty, but she knew it was merely a matter of perspective. Life continued quietly, like a slow pulse beneath the surface. She sometimes imagined the stories that traveled with each passenger. Where they had been, where they were going, what awaited them at their destinations. She did not inquire, did not follow. The stories were only whispers she caught in passing, fragments that settled softly in her mind before fading. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of metal, wet leaves, and faint traces of tea from the stalls she sometimes passed on her way. Even the smells seemed quieter, less urgent, blending with the muted hum of the platform. Time slowed as evening deepened, yet the trains continued their rhythm, the people their purpose, and she remained a constant observer. Announcements were softer now, filtered through the gentle hum of lights and distant engines. The station's movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. A single train might arrive, pause, and depart, leaving behind only faint vibrations in the tiles. A few travelers would cross paths briefly, exchange a word or a glance, and continue. To anyone else, it might have seemed like emptiness. To her, it was a delicate, ongoing pattern. Her own presence did not disturb the balance. She did not rise, did not call out, did not move beyond the small space her bench offered. She existed quietly within the platform, a steady presence in the soft, half-empty, half-full world of evening. By the time darkness fully settled in, the station's rhythm slowed further. Only a handful of people remained, and the trains that arrived seemed gentler in their movement, quieter in their approach. Even then, the station was not empty, it simply moved with a more subtle cadence, one she could read as easily as morning light or the first sounds of a distant whistle. She stayed, enveloped in the calm of these evenings. The quiet fullness of the platform was a companion as reliable as the trains themselves. Though the station appeared empty to the unobservant, she knew better. Life existed in small, patient increments, and she was witness to it all, steady, unhurried, and entirely present. And so she remained on her bench, observing the soft pulse of the platform in the half-light, finding solace in the truth that emptiness was only a surface, and life continued quietly underneath, as constant and patient as she was. Her bag rested beside her on the bench, soft and worn, its shape unchanged by years of careful placement. It had never been fully packed, never filled with the necessities of travel, yet it carried a weight she felt each time she shifted her hand to its strap. It was not a heavy weight of objects, but a weight of possibility, of things imagined and then left behind. Inside, she carried only the small essentials: a folded scarf, a notebook she rarely opened, a pen with its cap snugly in place, and a ticket she had held for years without ever using. None of it demanded her attention. Each piece existed quietly, maintaining its place in the bag without requiring her action. The weight she sensed was not physical. It was the subtle presence of all the journeys she had considered but never begun. She sometimes lifted the bag slightly, feeling the strap press into her shoulder, and imagined what it might mean to fill it fully, to gather clothing, papers, or objects for a journey. She never acted on the thought. Packing was an intention she carried lightly, almost as if she were performing a ritual of readiness that had no destination. Other passengers moved past with heavy luggage, wheels rolling across tiles, zippers clicking, straps digging into shoulders. They adjusted their loads with care, arranging objects to prevent damage, to prepare for travel. She observed them without envy or desire. Her bag's emptiness was a comfort, its weight a quiet reminder that she did not need to go anywhere. Sometimes she pressed a hand over the top of the bag and felt the softness of its folds, imagining objects inside that were never there. A book she might read, a letter she might write, a scarf for warmth she might need in a distant place. All of these existed only in imagination, yet they added to the weight, imperceptible but persistent. The bag shaped her posture. She leaned slightly toward it when seated, its presence steadying her. It was a companion that required no conversation, no planning, no acknowledgement. Its weight was a gentle anchor, grounding her in the rhythm of waiting. Trains arrived and departed, announcements called out numbers and destinations, and passengers hurried past with their loaded bags. She felt none of the urgency that their movement implied. Her bag's quiet weight reminded her that she belonged to the platform in stillness, not in transit. Even in rain, wind, or shadow, the bag remained by her side. It did not shift or complain. Its emptiness was reliable, its weight predictable, its presence a silent testament to the life she had chosen, a life of observation, patience, and stillness. By evening, when the last passengers departed and the station grew quiet, she adjusted the strap and leaned slightly back. The bag had not changed, yet it had accompanied her through hours, days, and seasons. Its weight, though never heavy, had shaped the very way she moved and waited. And so she remained, hand brushing against the folds of the bag, aware of its subtle presence. She had learned the quiet power of carrying something that demanded nothing, of holding potential without action, and of feeling anchored by what was never packed but always present. Night at the station had a quiet rhythm all its own. The trains slowed, the announcements softened, and only a few passengers lingered before the darkness stretched fully across the tracks. For the woman, night was not a time to leave. It was a time to replay, to let the departures of the day pass through her mind slowly, like a series of soft echoes that never fully faded. She sat on her bench long after most people had gone, the bag resting at her side. Each train that had left remained vivid in her memory, the hiss of closing doors, the vibration of wheels against metal, the distant whistle fading into silence. She recalled the sequence of arrivals and departures almost exactly. Which train had come first, which had paused longest, which had slipped away without anyone noticing. The people who had boarded were less clear. Faces blended, conversations blurred, footsteps lost their distinct rhythms. Yet the trains themselves stayed sharp and precise, etched in her mind with perfect clarity. She replayed them again and again, not with longing, but with the calm attention of someone observing a familiar melody. Sometimes she imagined herself aboard one of the trains, moving forward along its tracks. She pictured the scenery outside the windows, the hum of wheels beneath her, the gentle sway of the carriages. Even in imagination, she never left the station. She watched herself as a passenger, separate and still, always observing rather than acting. The platform lights cast soft pools around her, illuminating the bench, the bag, and the edges of the yellow line. Shadows from the track stretched and shifted as the train's vibrations faded in memory. She closed her eyes briefly and let the echoes of departure settle around her like mist, neither urgent nor demanding, only persistent. Some nights, the rhythm of the departures became a lullaby. She could hear the sequence in her mind, a pause, a hiss, the pull of metal on rails, the soft diminishing of sound. It was a gentle, steady cadence that marked the passage of hours without requiring movement. Each train was a note, and she listened without interrupting. Even when the night grew colder, the platform empty and quiet, she remained on her bench. The memory of departures gave shape to the darkness. The trains had moved on, but their sounds, their vibrations, their order remained alive in her mind, as tangible as the bench beneath her or the bag at her side. By the time the station lights dimmed further and the night deepened fully, she had replayed the departures countless times. Each recollection was slightly different, colored by the mood of the evening, by the light, by the hush in the air. Yet each one returned to the same steady rhythm, the same reliable pattern of arrival and departure. And when she finally rose to leave, the echoes of the trains lingered, accompanying her along the familiar route home. Night did not demand she act, nor did it push her forward. It only offered time to replay the departures she had witnessed, to let them settle quietly, and to prepare for another day of still observation. In these nights, she discovered a subtle truth. That movement could exist without her participation, that departures could matter without requiring action, and that remembering could be as full as experiencing, if carried with patient attention. The woman had noticed him months ago, though she did not remember exactly when. He was always there, always quiet, occupying a bench a few feet away from hers. He did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. Their presence coexisted silently, a mutual acknowledgement of space without words. He arrived at predictable times, carrying a small satchel or bag, sometimes a folded newspaper, sometimes nothing at all. His posture was consistent, shoulders slightly rounded, hands resting lightly on knees or clasped together. She noticed these details, not out of curiosity, but because patterns had become important to her. The rhythm of his actions was a quiet companion, paralleling the trains and their arrivals. Passengers occasionally interacted with him, a greeting, a nod, a hurried question about a train. He responded minimally, never betraying impatience. The woman watched these exchanges from her bench, noting how he navigated them without altering his calm, unhurried presence. Unlike most people, he seemed unbound by urgency, unaffected by the rush around him. Sometimes she wondered what drew her attention to him, since she observed so many faces and movements every day. Perhaps it was the consistency of his stillness, a reflection of her own, or perhaps it was simply that he had become part of the platform's quiet architecture. She had no desire to approach, no impulse to speak. Observation was enough. Even on rainy days, when the platform was slick and fewer passengers moved about, he remained nearby, shielded under the same overhang as her bench. The sound of water falling on the roof mixed with the soft hum of departing trains, creating a gentle backdrop to their shared, silent vigil. They acknowledged nothing, yet each recognized the presence of the other in the rhythm of waiting. Over time, she noticed small, almost imperceptible patterns in his behavior. He adjusted his scarf at the same moment she smoothed hers. He shifted slightly in his seat just as the sun glinted off the rails. These coincidences were not startling, only quietly familiar, adding to the sense that the station had its own pulse, one they both followed without speaking. He never boarded the trains. He waited as she waited. They existed side by side, separated by a few feet but connected through the unspoken understanding of shared stillness. In the midst of departures, announcements, and rushing passengers, their quiet companionship remained constant. By evening, when the platform emptied further and shadows stretched long, she could feel the presence of the familiar stranger as a part of the space itself. He was a marker, a steady note in the melody of her daily observation, neither intrusive nor demanding. When she finally rose to leave, he remained, just as he had every day. She walked past him without looking, yet she carried with her the subtle awareness of his presence. It was neither comforting nor distracting, it simply existed, part of the silent architecture of her world at the station. And in the pattern of arrivals and departures, in the rhythm of waiting, she understood that some presences needed no words, some companionship required no conversation, and some strangers could feel familiar without ever having been known. Winter arrived slowly at the station, first as a crispness in the air, then as a thin frost across the tiles, and finally as biting cold that nipped at fingers and noses. The woman noticed it immediately, not with surprise, but with a quiet recognition that the season had changed the rhythm of the platform. She walked along the familiar path, scarf wrapped tightly, hands tucked into the folds of her coat, her bag swinging lightly at her side. The trains seemed slower now, their sound softened by the dense, cold air. Even the footsteps of passengers were muffled, absorbed by the chill that clung to the station's corners. The heated waiting rooms became a small refuge for those unaccustomed to standing on the platform in the cold. Warm air, faintly scented with cleaning solution and faint traces of old upholstery, invited hurried passengers inside. People clustered near the radiators, rubbing gloved hands together, adjusting scarves, sipping hot drinks from disposable cups. The woman observed them quietly from her usual bench just outside, appreciating the contrast of warmth and movement against her own stillness. She never entered. Waiting had become both ritual and occupation, and the platform, even in winter, was where she belonged. She could feel the cold pressing softly against her, the way it stiffened the air, sharpened sound, and made distant noises seem clearer. Every hiss of a departing train, every clatter of footsteps on icy tiles, carried through the cold with a distinct, precise resonance. Passengers in the heated rooms moved differently, their urgency slightly altered by comfort. Conversations were softer, pauses longer, smiles gentler in the warmth. She watched as they fidgeted with coats, sipped from cups, adjusted belongings. Outside, the cold created a rhythm of waiting that was slow and deliberate, yet full of presence. The trains themselves seemed transformed by the season. Metal glimmered with frost in the early morning light. Steam rose from exhausts, swirling into the air and mingling with the faint mist. The sound of wheels against rails was sharper in the still winter air, a crisp punctuation to arrivals and departures. She listened carefully, cataloging each nuance, letting the cold make the patterns more distinct. Evening fell earlier in winter, shadows deepening across the platform tiles. The yellow line glowed faintly under the soft station lights, guiding passengers who lingered outside. Fewer people were present on the benches now, yet she remained, undisturbed, as the cold pressed lightly against her coat and scarf. Waiting had not changed, only the atmosphere surrounding it. She sometimes imagined the warmth of the heated rooms inside, but only fleetingly. There was no desire to enter. The platform offered clarity, the trains, the patterns, the quiet rhythm of departures. The cold only heightened her awareness, sharpening her senses without demanding action. By night, the platform emptied further. Steam from the last departing train lingered in the frosty air. The woman adjusted her scarf once more, shifted slightly on the bench, and let the chills settle around her. The station, the trains, the few remaining passengers, and the whisper of the cold air formed a quiet symphony, one she listened to with careful attention. Winter waiting was different, but it was still waiting. It was still observation. And she remained, steady and patient, her bench and bag familiar companions, as the season moved around her with its soft insistence, while she sat quietly in the still rhythm of the station. Announcements came and went with regularity, clear at first, precise, intended to inform and guide. Over time, however, they had begun to fade for her, not in volume, but in significance. The words were still spoken, train numbers, destinations, delays, but they no longer carried weight. She heard them, yet they no longer stirred her into action. The station speakers hummed overhead, crisp and deliberate, but she had stopped responding. Passengers around her glanced at screens, checked watches, and adjusted bags when their trains were called. She remained seated, bag at her side, eyes tracing the worn tiles of the platform, as if the announcements were background rhythm rather than instructions to follow. She recalled a time when each call had demanded attention, each repetition a subtle push forward, a reminder that life required movement. That urgency had faded slowly, almost imperceptibly, until announcements became only part of the station's constant hum. They were sounds among many, wheels on rails, footsteps, the hiss of doors, but no longer signals to act. Occasionally, she allowed herself to notice the tone, the sharpness of consonants, the rise and fall of voices. Some announcements were urgent in style, rapid and clipped, others were soft, almost resigned, stretched over the speaker with mechanical politeness. Still, she did not move. She had learned to listen without reacting, to let the words pass through her like wine through the open station. Passengers who had arrived with clear purpose often shifted uneasily when announcements interrupted their waiting. Some cursed under breath, others sighed, checking phones for updates. She observed quietly, noting how each person responded differently, each movement a small variation in a pattern that had become predictable. Sometimes the announcements spoke of cancellations or delays. The station might fill with murmurs, hurried steps, and soft curses. Yet she remained calm, seated with the same quiet steadiness she had cultivated for years. The trains would come or go, people would move or linger, and the words in the speakers would continue to exist without directing her. Even when she noticed the voice repeat the same number or name, she let it pass. It was no longer a command, only sound. It marked nothing in her mind except the continued presence of the station, its trains, and the ongoing rhythm of arrivals and departures she had long observed. By evening, the announcements became softer, less frequent, as the station emptied and the rhythm slowed. The few remaining passengers listened closely, adjusting themselves to the information. She did not. Her awareness had shifted inward, focused on movement, patterns, and silence rather than the content of speech. And so the announcements existed alongside her without intrusion. They were background noise, part of the texture of waiting, rather than a call to action. In their repetition and redundancy, she found calm, a gentle reminder that not every word demands attention, and that some sounds can be heard without being heard at all. By the time she rose to leave, the speakers had spoken many times over. Their words lingered in the air, but she carried none of them forward. She walked through the station quietly, past echoes of announcements that had once guided her, now simply part of the enduring rhythm she had learned to inhabit. Over time, the station ceased to feel merely like a place of transit. It had become something more subtle, more personal. A second home built from hours, days, and seasons spent in quiet observation. The benches were familiar under her body, the yellow line a boundary she had grown comfortable with, the platform tiles worn in patterns she could almost trace with her eyes closed. She knew every corner, every crack, every faint stain that told of past spills or hurried footsteps. Even the scent of the station, the mix of metal, dust, old wood, and faint traces of tea or pastries from the small stall, had become comforting, a constant that marked her presence as much as her own breathing did. Passengers came and went, transient and hurried, yet she moved through the space as though it belonged to her in ways that did not interfere with theirs. She understood the rhythms of arrivals and departures, the subtle cues in the air, the echoes of footsteps, and the faint vibrations from trains approaching or leaving. Every sound, every shift, was part of the environment she had grown to inhabit naturally. She occasionally thought about other places, distant towns or cities she might have visited. Yet none offered the quiet companionship she found in the station. Trains arrived and departed with dependable predictability, announcements provided a soft rhythm, and the familiar stranger on a nearby bench became part of her sense of belonging. Here, in the constant ebb and flow of movement without demand, she had carved a small sanctuary. The bag at her side, folded scarf, and the ever-present ticket were extensions of this home, markers of permanence in a space defined by transience. She had learned to navigate waiting with care and attention, making the platform a space of comfort and order rather than uncertainty or stress. Even seasonal changes felt personal. The crispness of winter, the softness of late autumn light, the warmth of summer evenings. They all became part of her experience, elements she had learned to anticipate and accommodate. The station adapted with the world around it, but her place within it remained steady. By evening, when most passengers had left, she lingered longer than most. She adjusted her scarf, shifted her bag, and watched the tracks fade into darkness. The platform lights glowed softly, marking the space as hers in the quiet, unspoken way that a home provides shelter without requiring ownership. It was not a home built of walls or doors, but of habit, observation, and patience. It offered protection not from the world outside, but from the hurriedness, noise, and demands that filled it at other hours. Here, she could exist fully, calmly, and uninterrupted. The station, like a patient host, accommodated her stillness. It offered constancy in the midst of movement, a place where trains and people passed through without demanding engagement. Over the years, she had accepted it quietly, allowing the rhythms of arrivals and departures to form a backdrop to her own quiet presence. Time had taken on a peculiar shape at the station. Days were no longer marked by clocks, schedules, or appointments, but by the arrivals of trains. Each train's approach created a quiet punctuation in the rhythm of her existence, a natural measure that required no attention beyond watching and listening. She began to recognize subtle differences in each arrival. Some trains glided in smoothly, their brakes whispering against the rails. Others rumbled and shuddered, announcing themselves with authority. The cadence of wheels, the soft hiss of doors, the faint vibrations through the platform, each train had its own signature, and she could anticipate them long before they appeared. Passengers followed their own schedules, but they did not dictate her time. She sat on her bench, bag at her side, scarf tucked around her neck, and counted the day by arrivals. Morning brought one sequence, afternoons another, evenings a slower, gentler rhythm. Even when trains were delayed or cancelled, the anticipated pattern itself became the measure, a soft marker of passing hours. Her awareness extended to the smallest details. The wind shifted slightly as a train approached, carrying the smell of metal and distant rails. The platform tiles vibrated subtly, the yellow line seemed to hum with expectation, and the echo of footsteps reached her before the train was fully in sight. Each arrival was a signal that time was moving, yet she remained untouched by urgency. Sometimes she imagined a day without arrivals. It was a difficult concept. Without the trains, without the sequence of movement and pause, hours would stretch and blur. It was the rhythm of arrival and presence that gave structure, an invisible clock that required nothing but observation. The ticket in her bag, folded neatly for years, seemed almost symbolic of this system. It marked potential movement, yet it remained untouched, a quiet reminder that she did not need to participate. Time, measured by arrivals, existed whether she acted or not. The trains were the pulse of her day, and she counted it in their comings. By afternoon, the station filled with activity, but her measure of the day remained simple. The first train, second, third. Each a quiet bell marking the passage of hours. Human faces blurred, conversations passed, footsteps moved past her, yet the arrivals alone remained reliable. She did not rush, did not rise, did not need to intervene. Even when evening approached and the number of arrivals dwindled, she understood that time was measured in presence. One train, then another, each signaling that the day continued. Light shifted, shadows lengthened, and she remained seated, aware of the passage without haste, without interruption, but fully attuned to the rhythm of movement. By night, the platform emptied further, and the day's arrivals became fewer and more distinct. She counted each in memory, replaying the sequence quietly in her mind, anchoring herself in the soft structure that defined her day. It was a rhythm she had learned to rely on, a gentle clock that required no hands, no numbers, only the patient return of arriving trains. And so she measured her days, not by hours or schedules, but by arrivals. Each one marked a passage, a presence, a quiet acknowledgement that the world moved while she remained, attentive, patient, and entirely at ease in the slow, unfolding cadence of her chosen rhythm. There was a particular magic in the last train of the night. The station had quieted, leaving only a handful of passengers lingering and the soft hum of overhead lights. The air felt cooler, heavier, as if the day's movement had condensed into a single, final pulse. She watched from her bench, bag at her side, scarf snug around her neck, ready to witness the familiar rhythm once more. The last train approached with a distinct calm. Its wheels hummed softly against the rails, the metal glinting faintly under the station lights. The platform seemed to acknowledge its arrival with a hushed reverence, footsteps slowing, voices lowering, and even the wind itself appearing to pause for a brief moment. She noticed every nuance, every sound, as though it carried a secret only the station and she could understand. Passengers for this final departure were few. A weary commuter, a lone traveler with a small bag, a child asleep in their parents' arms. Their movements were measured, deliberate, almost ritualistic. She observed without engagement, tracing the quiet choreography as doors opened, feet stepped aboard, and the train's hiss of closing doors signaled the beginning of a final journey for the night. The whistle sounded, sharp yet gentle, a farewell that reverberated along the tracks and through the empty spaces of the platform. The train gathered momentum slowly, sliding into the darkness beyond the station, carrying its passengers into destinations she would never join. She felt no longing, only a calm understanding that the day's rhythm had reached a soft conclusion. In these moments, the station felt alive in a different way. Shadows stretched across benches and tiles, the yellow line glimmered faintly in the light, and the faint vibration of departing wheels lingered like a heartbeat in the cool air. The last train marked both an ending and a promise. That morning would come, another day of arrivals and departures, and the cycle would continue. She often imagined following the last train, walking beside it through the darkened tracks, feeling the rush of movement. Yet she never rose from her bench. Observation was her path, stillness was her choice. The last train's departure was a marker, a punctuation to her day, a reminder that life moves forward even when she remained in place. When the platform emptied completely, leaving only her presence and the echoes of wheels fading into night, she felt the station's rhythm settle around her. The soft hum of lights, the distant whistle now vanished, and the faint scent of metal and earth marked the quiet conclusion of another day. She remained seated for a few more moments, letting the emptiness and the lingering vibration of the last train fill the space around her. It was a calm, deliberate pause, a nightly ritual that reminded her of the steady flow of life outside her immediate presence, and the quiet constancy of her own choice to remain. And then, slowly, she adjusted her scarf, lifted her bag, and rose from the bench. The last train had departed, but its memory lingered in her mind, a gentle cadence marking the close of the day. She walked into the night, carrying with her the quiet rhythm of departures and arrivals, ready to return tomorrow for the next repetition of a cycle that had become the measure of her life. Over the years, something had quietly shifted in her perception. What had once been a conscious act, an endurance of time spent watching trains, counting arrivals, imagining journeys, had transformed into a state of being. Waiting was no longer waiting, it had become her natural rhythm, as effortless and unremarkable as breathing. She arrived each day with the same deliberate calm, sat on her familiar bench, and adjusted her scarf and bag with practiced ease. The platform, the tracks, the sound of approaching trains, they no longer represented tasks, obligations, or a sense of anticipation. They simply existed, and so did she, moving together in silent harmony. The trains themselves, once objects of careful observation, had become part of her internal rhythm. She no longer noted each arrival with sharp awareness or mentally catalogued departures. Instead, she felt them as gentle pulses within the flow of her day. The station's movements were extensions of her own being, and her own presence was an extension of the station. Even the people passing by no longer reminded her of what she was waiting for, or what she was missing. Faces blurred without significance, conversations drifted past like soft winds, and a familiar stranger on the neighboring bench remained an unobtrusive companion. Waiting had lost its tension, it had become seamless integration with the life around her. Announcements, which had once punctuated the day with urgency, now existed only as ambient sound. She noticed their presence but required no response. The yellow line, the tiles, the rhythm of footsteps. Everything merged into a subtle cadence that guided her attention without compelling action. She no longer felt an internal pressure to move, to act, or to respond. Even seasonal changes felt absorbed into her being rather than imposed upon it. The crisp chill of winter, the soft glow of autumn evenings, the warmth of summer sun, all became elements of her experience, coloring the platform without altering her fundamental stillness. She was part of the environment, and it was part of her. By night, when the platform emptied and the last trains had departed, the sense of waiting dissolved entirely. She rose, gathered her bag, and stepped lightly across tiles now faintly lit by the station lamps. There was no need to measure time, no need to anticipate movement. The platform and she had become inseparable, two presences existing side by side, neither hurried, neither absent. In that quiet understanding, waiting had lost its defining edge. It no longer implied expectation, impatience, or desire. It had become a calm continuum, a soft integration with the rhythm of arrivals, departures, and the gentle pulse of life moving past. And so she remained, day after day, hour after hour, in a state where waiting was not an act but a way of being, silent, patient, seamless, and entirely present in the quiet heartbeat of the station she had made her second home. The bench had become more than a seat. Over the years, it had learned the contours of her presence, the gentle curve of her back, the way she crossed her legs, the slight tilt of her head as she observed the platform. It seemed to remember her posture, molding itself subtly to her body, offering quiet comfort without words or awareness. Each day she approached it with the same routine. A slow step onto the platform, her bag resting lightly at her side, scarf adjusted against the wind, and finally, a careful settling onto the familiar wood. The bench embraced her in the way a well-worn object does, supporting without judgment, steadying without intrusion. She rarely thought about it, yet its presence was as reliable as the trains themselves. The world moved around her. Passengers hurried past, shoes clacking against the tiles, voices carrying in bursts of conversation, luggage scraping along the platform. The station echoed with announcements, the hiss of trains, and the faint whistle of wind through gaps in the roof. But on her bench, all of this was softened, filtered into a calm rhythm that she had come to depend on. She noticed small changes that marked the passing of time, the faint grooves worn deeper in the wood, the subtle shift in color from sunlight and rain, even the tiny scratches that hinted at past visitors. Yet none of these altered the bench's essential familiarity. It remained hers in function, if not in ownership, a constant presence amid the flow of movement and sound. Sometimes she would adjust slightly, shifting her weight, stretching one leg, brushing a leaf from the edge of the seat. Each motion was absorbed effortlessly, as if the bench had anticipated it. She imagined it learning her habits, cataloging the way she settled into its form, matching her presence with silent understanding. Even the bag at her side seemed to know its place beside the bench. The folds of her scarf, the small ticket kept folded for years, and the notebook she rarely opened. All became part of the space, quietly integrated into the shape of her waiting. Together, bench, bag, scarf, and body created a small island of stillness amid the station's constant motion. At dusk, when the platform emptied and the last trains had departed, the bench seemed to hold her a little more securely. Shadows stretched across the tiles, the yellow line faded into darkness, and the soft hum of the station lights filled the air. She leaned back slightly, closed her eyes briefly, and let the familiar contours cradle her, steadying her in the quiet. The bench, shaped by her years of presence, had become a silent companion, attentive to her rhythms, patient with her waiting, and unwavering in its quiet support. It was more than wood and nails, it was a marker of constancy, a witness to countless departures and arrivals, a subtle anchor in a life measured by trains, time, and quiet observation. Some days passed with a gentle rhythm that almost went unnoticed, but once in a while, a day arrived when nothing changed at all. The trains came and went on schedule, the announcements called numbers and destinations, passengers moved past with their familiar hurried steps, but the platform felt suspended in quiet repetition, as if the world had pressed pause. She sat on her bench as usual, bag at her side, scarf tucked neatly, watching the ordinary unfold with unbroken continuity. The cold, the warmth of sunlight, the shifting shadows, all were present as they always had been, but they carried no new events, no interruptions, no surprises. Even the familiar stranger remained seated on the neighboring bench, unchanged, a silent partner in this quiet stasis. Passengers moved past her in familiar patterns, the commuter checking his watch, the child gripping a parent's hand, the small group clustered near the ticket counter. Faces blurred as usual, footsteps echoed predictably, and the sound of doors opening and closing marked arrivals and departures with mechanical precision. Nothing startled her, nothing invited her attention beyond the natural rhythm of observation. Even the trains themselves seemed subdued, gliding into the station with their usual grace yet without the subtle quirks she had sometimes noticed on other days. Wheels hummed on rails, doors hissed softly, and the faint whistle of the conductor reached her ears, yet all felt muted, ordinary, and unremarkable. It was a day defined by consistency, unbroken and even, where nothing demanded a response. Announcements passed overhead, but their meaning, their urgency, had dissolved long ago. They were merely sounds within the larger texture of the station, absorbed into the quiet continuity of her day. She did not rise, adjust, or respond. She existed alongside them, observing but untouched, fully present without expectation. Even the light remained steady, neither harsh nor dim, casting gentle reflections across the platform tiles. Shadows fell in the same familiar angles, the yellow line glimmered in its predictable path, and the air held its usual mixture of metal, dust, and faint traces of distant tea or pastry. Everything existed exactly as it always had, and she felt no desire to alter it. By evening, as the platform emptied slowly and the last train departed into darkness, she reflected briefly on the simplicity of the day. No disruptions, no changes, no surprises, only the enduring rhythm she had come to rely on. It was a comfort, a confirmation of continuity, a quiet reminder that some days need nothing more than presence and observation. And so she rose, gathered her bag, adjusted her scarf, and stepped lightly into the night. The station had remained steady, her bench had held her, the trains had moved as always, and she had remained in harmony with it all. On a day when nothing changed, she realized that constancy itself could be profound, a gentle affirmation that the quiet, measured rhythm of her life was enough. The woman sat on her bench, bag at her side, scarf tucked snugly around her neck, and watched the evening settle across the station. The platform was quiet now, illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights, shadows stretching long across tiles worn smooth by countless footsteps. The trains had come and gone all day, as they always did, and now one final train approached, a train she noticed, yet somehow felt she had seen countless times before. It slid into the station with the familiar hiss of brakes and the subtle vibration beneath the platform, a sound she had come to know as intimately as her own heartbeat. Doors opened, passengers moved inside, and the train rested briefly before pulling away again. To any observer, it was ordinary, indistinguishable from every other train she had watched arrive and depart over the years. To her, it carried the same calm certainty, the same quiet rhythm that had come to define her existence. She did not rise. She did not reach for her ticket or adjust her bag. The movement of the train did not disturb her, nor did it call her to action. Its wheels rolled away into the distance, the faint echo fading into the night, leaving behind the soft, empty hum of the platform. It was, in every way, like all the others, and yet, in its ordinariness, it contained the essence of everything she had come to understand about the station, about time, and about herself. Passengers who remained on the platform lingered for a moment, then departed, their movements hurried or absent-minded, transient and fleeting. Faces blurred, conversations drifted past, and footsteps receded into memory. The train itself became part of the fading backdrop, a final punctuation to the day's rhythm of arrivals and departures. She observed, quietly and deliberately, the residual vibrations and the fading light reflecting off rails and tiles. In that ordinary passing, she recognized the extraordinary constancy of her world, the endless repetition that had become both her companion and her measure of life. Every train had passed this way, yet each had contributed to the steady heartbeat she had grown to inhabit, a pulse that existed independently of urgency or expectation. Even as darkness deepened and the platform emptied, the woman remained on her bench. The train's departure, like all the others, left no void, only the continuation of rhythm and stillness, a gentle affirmation that her patient observation was enough. She had lived countless days in tandem with the comings and goings of the station, and each passing train, no matter how ordinary, had stitched the threads of her life together quietly and without demand. She adjusted her scarf one last time, rested her hand lightly on her bag, and exhaled slowly. The train had passed, like all the others, but in its ordinariness lay the completeness of her days. Arrivals, departures, waiting, observing, remembering, this was her world, steady, patient, and unbroken. And as she finally rose from the bench, the station held its familiar quiet around her, the rhythm of the tracks and the echoes of trains continuing into the night. One train had passed, like all the others, and she, in her calm constancy, remained, fully present at the heart of her enduring world.